Okay, so as we said, the session is on practical tips and advice for taking on the role of a mentor for trainees, for a newly qualified teacher, and for teachers that are new to the profession. Regardless of where you are, you might have a new teacher in there who's maybe new to the school as well, or even you know, someone who is moving across to your school. We may also have some people on this session tonight who are aspiring mentors, or who have been given the opportunity to maybe think about doing this role, maybe during the pandemic lockdown, or you may be taking some this new aspect of a role, this new role on for next year, who knows. Certainly all the tips and the advice that I'm giving you tonight are all tried and tested. Some of them are based on research, because obviously things that I've done over the past 32 years have been things I've gone into, had to research and make sure that I know what the best research was to be able to inform my own practice. And it was interesting to note that I dropped in on a couple of lessons last week, actually, of teachers that are teaching. I was asked to do some Q&A of it in a very positive way, and that was the 8,862nd lesson that I have done in my teaching career. And you might think I'm a bit sad, but I've always found that quite interesting from the day one. Whom have I observed? And that was one of my an interesting statistic for me to see that, because I've kept all of my lesson observations, whether they've been handwritten or not, and I've got files of them here in my study, but also online as well. Then I keep them, and I've seen so many teachers teach over the years, whether in many sort of different jobs I've had and roles, that obviously a lot of the information you're going to get from me tonight is going to be stuff that I've definitely used and things I've learned myself. So obviously you may well find that the tips I'm giving you tonight are not going to be your cup of tea, maybe, or maybe they will work for you. So please be mindful of the fact that I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you a sort of an idea of things that worked for me, and I know have worked for many colleagues over the years that I've worked with. So please, you know, take them and use them as best you can. And the ones that you don't feel are going to work for you, then obviously you may well just park those and not use them. So we're moving on to the actual sessions that we're going to be covering tonight, looking at managing the mentor relationship, mentoring during a pandemic, observing and giving feedback, which is really important, and having those difficult conversations with a member of staff who maybe you've had to give some feedback to, which hasn't really been what you've wanted to give. It's really quite interesting to know that as a person who's got responsibility for mentoring another colleague, you know, you have an entitlement to have that dedicated mentor time as well with you in the week, because it's one of the most challenging jobs that you may well ever do, and it's really important that you're given the time and the space to do that. If you are a teacher in the UK, the early careers framework is now what's coming in from this August, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But certainly, before I hand over to my colleague Zoe, who's going to talk us through the first slide that we've got, it's really important to know that at this time last year, when we were in 2020, there were 5,000 fewer applications for coming into teaching than there are now. So obviously the pandemic has had a big impact upon the number of staff and people who are thinking of going into teaching from September. So the role of the mentor is going to be even more important, because there are going to be more and more of new teachers that are going to need to be mentored going forward into next academic year. And I don't think anybody could say that we haven't faced a more challenging year. So the session tonight will look at some ideas for the pandemic and what we've learned from that pandemic, and also ideas that we can move forward with. Okay, so with that, I'll hand over to Zoe, who's going to think about the mentee perspective. Okay, Zoe.
Thanks very much, Elaine. So yeah, as Elaine said, I'm Zoe, and I'll be talking about the mentee perspective, because in order to be a good mentor, I think you really need to think about your own experience as a mentee yourself. And Elaine has lots and lots of experience of working with as a mentor, whereas although I am an experienced teacher, my experience of being a mentee was a bit more recent. So the first thing I'd like you to do really is to think about your own experience when you were mentee. That could have been as a trainee, that could have been as a newly qualified teacher. And indeed, if you want to write anything in the chat, we'd love to hear. So think about who as a mentor was really positive for you, who was a really good role model, and what was it about what they did that made you feel supported and was a positive influence on you. And conversely, that you may have unfortunately had a negative experience in perhaps in a different placement. And if so, what was it that they did that maybe you would want to learn from and not to do that if you were unfortunately not as supported? And from that, that's going to be your starting point for you as a mentor of what you want to do and what you're not going to do. And I think it's really important, particularly if you are quite experienced in your career as a teacher, to really think back to what it's like being a mentee and being a newer teacher or even a trainee. So a lot of what you do now, in terms of, for example, your behaviour management and your planning and so on, is based on your wealth of experience. But of course, your mentee probably doesn't have that yet. And so many things that they might be looking to you for in terms of, you know, modelling on the way that you teach, they're going to have a very different experience to you. And one example of that is with behaviour management. So as a more established teacher within a school, a lot of your behaviour management is very difficult to see because it's under the skin now. It's based on the reputation you have, the respect that you have, the relationships that you develop with students over time. And you might find, not always, but you might find that you can go into a classroom and you do your countdown or whatever, and your students are just quiet because they know you, they know that's what your expectations are, they respect you and so on. Not always the case, unfortunately, but a lot of the time. And yet your trainee, your NQT or whoever can go into the same class, try exactly the same techniques. On the surface, to them it seems the same, and they don't get the same response, and that can be really disheartening. So try to think back to that time and to unpick what it is that you're actually doing. So think about what it was like when you were new. The next thing that I would suggest, again, really trying to get into the mind of your mentee as well, is about your guidance. So guide gently. We have all been there. We know that when you're an NQT or when you're a trainee, you can have, you know, a lot of really fantastic ideas and really kind of this drive to do something very whizzy, very active. And this is absolutely a great thing. That enthusiasm is brilliant. And I say this as somebody who's absolutely done this. Sometimes it takes a little while and a bit of experience to work out what you do, what you're doing, which is good for the learning, and what you're doing just what's a gimmick in a sense. So I remember spending hours and hours and hours making these incredibly resource heavy lessons, which involved people climbing all over the furniture trying to get post-it notes and doing QR codes and doing all kinds of things, because that's how I was encouraged, and that's, you know, as an enthusiastic young trainee in NQT, that's kind of what I thought a good lesson should be. And I had a really good mentor as an NQT, who she really carefully navigated that very narrow path between, she didn't rain on my parade and she didn't sort of, you know, squash me down, but she also guided me to see that a lot of the time I was putting more time into the resources than I was actually getting out of them in the class, and that sometimes all I was really just doing is hyping up some teenagers and thinking that it was learning, and it really wasn't. So yeah, really, and I can see people in the chat saying, yeah, I remember that too, and we've all been there. So yeah, try to really navigate that and not crushing them and encouraging that enthusiasm, but using your experience as well, and talk about yourself personally, because I think as a mentee, you can feel that, well, this person has got so much more experience than me, they know what they're doing and I don't, and they need to remember that you're human, you've been there too, and you do know what it's like. You're not being patronising, you have learned it as well. Sometimes when I look back on my lesson plans that I did for observations as an NQT or as a trainee, and I just wonder, what was I doing? How did I have that much time? I didn't. And actually, you know, I could do a far more pared down lesson, which actually really gets to the meat of it now, and try to guide them in that way. On the other hand, be prepared to learn from them, and I'm sure you would, of course. But what I found really supportive from my mentor as an NQT was that she really did pick up on certain things. So certain activities I did, or certain strengths that I had, she despite, you know, having taught for 20 odd years, she had said, yeah, I've never seen that before. I really like that. I'm going to use that in my lesson. And she had a sort of system, because she was also head of department, for looking at different strengths of different teachers that there were in the department and encouraging us to observe each other for particular areas. She identified that my strength at the time, was what she said, was stickability. So finding a way to kind of hook students and make them less memorable. So she actually invited people to come and observe me for that reason. And as an NQT, that really helped me. It massively boosted my ego, because I could see there was something that I was being recognised for being good at, which then conversely made it easier for me to then accept constructive feedback and take on that, and it was seen as a very non-judgmental thing. So the final point I want to say is about sharing your own vulnerability. As I mentioned before, talking about when you were in their situation as well. You will be on a bit of a pedestal, so making sure that they can see you are a human, you have your terrible days as well. Sometimes as an NQT or a trainee, it feels like everybody else has got no behaviour management problems whatsoever, and all the students just hate you. And actually, there's something very powerful about seeing a far more experienced teacher come into the staff room and say, do you know what? That didn't go very well at all. I've had a bad day. And actually then watching how you can pick it up again and move on, and seeing that that is something that everybody has. So that's me from the mentee perspective. Please do put your comments in the chats as people are doing. I'll be publishing them, and I'm going to pass back over to Elaine to talk about more from her experience as a mentor.
Thank you, Zoe. It's really useful insight into the mentee perspective. So mentoring during a pandemic, then, it's been an interesting time, hasn't it, for all of us? And I think when your NQT comes back, the reconnection and the reflection, or your trainee, I will refer to them as our mentee from now on going forward, because we've obviously got colleagues joining us from different areas in the world, and therefore you will not be familiar with the same terms that we use in certain countries. So obviously reconnecting and reflecting with them. What's been their biggest success and their biggest challenge is a good way to sort of do that when you first meet them. Obviously, you may well have been having, and hopefully you will have been having, your mentor meetings with them, whether that be online or on the phone. And you may well find that your relationship with your NQT has actually got deeper because you've been texting, you might have been WhatsApping, whatever way you've used to be staying in connection with them. So you might find that the the relationship has actually already got doesn't need any reconnection and reflection, but certainly that face-to-face actual bodily presence in the room will need to have some consideration when you go back into the classroom and you go back into your schools, whenever that happens to be. I know in the UK, well, certainly in England, it's from next week. You'll need to look at where the gaps are in that mentee's journey and how do you fill them. But it's really important that you take baby steps and you manage the well-being of your mentee. You need to slow down and manage the workload. It might even be that some of your mentees have regressed a little bit because they've not been in the classroom. They've not actually had that physical presence. They've not been able to see the students as much because the cameras may well have been off. And so that in itself is going to pose quite a big challenge. Some of your colleagues that are coming back may well be feeling very anxious about this, particularly if they are at home with parents, or maybe dealing with issues where they have people who've been shielding, and as a result of that they may well not have had an injection, and as a result of it you're going to have that anxiety as well to deal with. So it's a very much a baby step, softly approach in the first few weeks when we go back. Obviously the challenges with the lack of classroom experience, they've not been in the classroom to be able to have you in or whoever is going to be observing them, particularly you, as an actual presence in there. So that's going to be something you're going to have to almost like start again with. And then the difficulty with observations again. You may well have been dropping in on their lessons that they've been teaching through being able to be part of their team, or sometimes that might not have been possible. So the isolation during the remote teaching has it for all of us in the profession has been something that we've not found easy to deal with, and they're even more vulnerable as a trainee or as a young teacher, a teacher new to the profession. Also, we don't know who's been watching the lessons at home that they've been delivering. You could have had mum, dad, carer, grandma, granddad, older brother, sibling, whatever in the background. So again, that's an interesting insight into who has been watching your mentees teach. That's an interesting conversation for them, how they feel that they will have come across to someone who is not a pupil, who is not a teacher, and an interesting conversation to have with them. Always keep it positive with your mentee, always from the beginning. Think about they've learned to think on their feet, they've adapted to change, and focus on the minimum critical learning that they need themselves. What is it that is going to turn their practice, that is going to make them better from what you're seeing at the moment? Some schools have asked their new staff to the profession, in fact all staff, to video some of their lessons. Some staff have done that, some haven't. If they have some footage that they've been able to capture, then that may well be a starting point for you to look at and see what they've actually done. Is there anything in there that you can bring the positives out of and build off back once they're back in the classroom? And obviously the online observations, I've just talked about that with the camera and with the microphone off. It's more it's obviously less intrusive that they've been used to. So when you get back into the classroom, and I can think of several staff that I've mentored over the years who have been extremely worried about having someone in the classroom, and we started whatever journey you began with your mentee. It could have been this might have been at the end of their training when we went into lockdown in January, so they might have had lots of observations, or they might only be starting in January as a new teacher and you're mentoring them. So you may well be starting from, well, this is the first time they've been observed properly in a classroom with yourself, or it might be the end of the time, but they still will be nervous. So it's going to be, again, something that you're going to have to build and start with a little bit, the baby steps. I cannot emphasize that enough, the baby steps and the little bits of things that you do with them. And we'll mention that in a little while. Obviously, reintegrating them back into the school is going to be a big part of your job. The social interaction, we've all missed that over the last few months. Maybe you've had the opportunity to check in with them regularly, or you've maybe had coffee online or a lunch break or something like that, if you've had the time to do that and you've been able to keep your slot, in which case that's been great. But it's still really important to try and, even though you're going back to a full teaching load and having to support the testing of all the students and everything, it's really important to see if you can still manage that weekly time with them. And obviously if you can't do it that way, then using interactive Zoom, Teams, however you feel you can do that is maybe something that's positively come out of the pandemic and might be something that you could use as an additional support for your mentee going forward. So the most important skill in my experience has always been, as a mentor, is to be able to listen. And this is the Chinese symbol for listening. You're listening with your ears, they listen to you with your eyes, your heart, and you're giving them your undivided attention. And I think this undivided attention, the fourth one there, is so important when you're observing a colleague. And over my years, I've done a lot of training of mentors and actually supported them to develop the skills that you need, which we'll look at briefly over the next sort of slide or so. Okay. So managing the mentor relationship is a tricky one. You really need to be able to create a culture of that mutual respect and trust. You need to be open with them and honest. Sometimes that brutal honesty is something which we don't naturally sit comfortably with, and you have to develop a way in which you can agree to deliver certain messages that have to be delivered to your mentee, if things are not going very well, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. You need to show that you're really interested in your mentee. Otherwise, why are you doing the job? Have you just been told you have to do it? Some colleagues have to do that, but if you're going to do this job, you might as well do it well. Otherwise, it's not worth bothering. So having the time and the willingness to develop that relationship is crucial. And that very first meeting with them can be, well, it sets the scene, doesn't it? It sets the scene for everyone, for your mentee, for you, and everything. So it's a little bit special to that person, and showing that you are positive, you are mindful that they are in a situation of possible vulnerability, you are there to help them get through this time which you will be spending with them as their mentor. And we're talking now about whether it's in the pandemic, which is hopefully going to be coming towards its close, or at least making not as bad as it's been, and obviously in the normal world when we're back in school properly and things get back to somewhat of a normality. As part of your mentor role, you need to be thinking, do I build a good rapport, and if so, how do I know that? And do you relate well to people? You know, do you come across as someone who wants to help and develop others in terms of your meetings that you have with your mentee? Are you a good listener? Have you got really good interpersonal skills? You probably are, because most people in teaching do have. They're there because we get on, we communicate well, we listen well. Do you ask effective questions? You know, are you asking open questions or closed questions? It's really vital that there's a mixture of these. Are you able to give constructive feedback? And I think it's important to keep an open mind. And as Zoe said earlier, that you know your vulnerability and a recognition of your own needs. If you need to bring someone in who is a subject specialist or a phase specialist, which you might not be able to bring to the experience with your mentee, because I know in some schools, especially if you're in a small school, you might not have a mentor who is your subject or your phase if you're in primary. And sometimes it's important to be able to access that support, whether you have to contact the local authority or another school, or maybe someone in your own trust or your own area. If there is something which you feel you need support with, then don't be thinking it's a weakness of yours, because it's not. It's recognizing that you need that support. But above all, I think it's important to enjoy the experience of being a mentor. For the second, third, fourth and fifth bullet points there, I've got a questionnaire which would guide you to be able to answer those 4 questions. And it's part of a coaching package that I did a few years ago when I put something together to do some coaching and mentoring with quite a few NQTs, mentors, and also people who were doing feedback to other teachers who were being supported to develop their practice. If you would like to receive a copy of those, I'm more than happy to send those out. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. It's really about developing your mentor as a mentor for your mentee. You need to be able to catch them before they fall, really. You are kind of like making sure that they're not going to hit the ground. You can see something is not working, or something that is working really, really well, maybe, but you need to be in that position where you can support them before things get really difficult. So it's important to sort of discuss that with them and look at where things are going in terms of the relationship. It's also really your job to unlock that person's potential, to maximize their performance. So it's about finding where the strengths are, where are the current strengths, and how you can build on that. When they come to you as a mentee, they will probably have a development target of maybe 2 or 3. And it's always good to look at the end goal, where you want to be in whatever timescale you've got, whether you've got a full-time member of staff that you're working with, or if it's somebody who's part-time, that may take longer. Is to look at establishing, then working back from the key milestones. And then once you've done that, you can then look forward. What's the first one? What's the second step we need to make? And again, going back to that baby steps that I mentioned previously, those tiny steps will have a big impact. It's like we do this with children. You, in your classroom, you make sure that they can do something and they understand it before they move on. because that can cause lots of problems for them if they don't understand what you're asking them to do. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. You may have to move backwards in this journey of your end goal moving back because of today's environment. And if you feel that your NQT has, your newly qualified teacher, your mentee has regressed, then that's not a sign of anything other than, well, at the moment they're not quite yet there in meeting the teacher standards or meeting whatever standards you are judging them by. So therefore, it might well be that you have to go back a little bit and revisit something, as you will have to do with your classes that you're teaching. It's really about what will have the most impact on your mentee's practice and isolating that most critical area and being excited with your mentee to see what impact this will have on their practice and on their pupils going forward. And present it in small steps, as Rosenshine said in 2012, you know, it's important to take these tiny steps and move forward as you would do with your children in your classroom, and make it really explicit and clear the chain of events that connects that final goal and the success of each of the steps and how you're going to achieve each of these. Bite-sized and mini segments. If you avoid overload with your mentee, as you do with your students, the chances are presenting the material in the small steps will, with lots of modelling and practice after each step, will stop anything from blocking any progress that they make. Explaining to them what they need to do and assisting in their practice and giving them step-by-step guidance so that they experience success. And I cannot underline how important it is for us to experience success, particularly in today's world, in any world of being a mentor, but certainly at the moment, that success, especially with the aspects of the job that are unfamiliar to them, as Zoe said earlier, something that you might find really straightforward to do because you've been in this job for many years or for a few years or even 2 or 3 years yourself, to an NQT will be a big mountain to climb. And unpicking that with them and making sure that they understand what they need to do will be, and what you're expecting of them and what's expected of them by the school, will be a much more fruitful and an enriching experience to them than not having that explanation. So again, what's the precise target and why it is the next step then to improve the teaching? Okay, what is that next step? Okay, making sure that you can support with practicing the target. So you're setting up what they want to do. If you're in the classroom and they need to see something, right, you might need to write a script for what they're going to say in this particular part of the lesson. You might need to plan and write that together. So they have I do this, I do that, I do this. And then you might need to run it with them, guide them through it, get them into that focus of the mindset so that they understand what's needed of them. Keep watching what they're doing and don't let your your kind of like attention go. Make sure you're giving them micro feedback. You can't give them feedback which is detailed enough. None of us like to be micromanaged, but with this particular thing, when you're looking at a target, the micro feedback on the target is absolutely crucial to support good sound improvements. And then practice it again, practice it and feedback again. You know, you could actually refine or think aloud as you are talking about what you're doing. And again, if you were doing something where they have to, I mentioned in the next point, if it's a process that they're doing, for example, planning a lesson or a scheme of lessons or an activity or a practical, talk it through and think it aloud. Put yourself as a mentor in the place of the student and watch as it goes. What are the key areas where things might get misconceived, and look at that with your mentee to see how you can make sure that doesn't become a barrier to their progress. Lots of opportunities for modelling and demonstrating what they need to be able to teach in these tiny little segments of teaching, mini segments. Low stakes environment with your guidance. So when I do my mentoring, I always take my mentee to the classroom that they're going to be delivering it in. And we sit there with no children and we say, right, let's do it. I'm going to do it first for you. We are going to do it together, and then you do it. So it's the I do, we do, you do approach. Okay, and that enables the mentee to see where they're actually going to be delivering that. What does it look like without the children there, but they're actually delivering it on the spot? So they're getting that experience without any children in the classroom. That is so powerful, because they can then think themselves, well, this is going to be me in 2 hours time, or in a week's time, or even tomorrow, something like that. And then ask them, do they understand what you've modelled, how it's different from their current practice? Again, a lot of the things we're talking about tonight are all kind of like mingled up, and they all go together. So again, this could be something that you're going to do after you've observed your colleague in the classroom. The use of language is really important. Turning a positive statement into a negative statement, into a negative one. Turning a positive statement into a negative one. I think I meant to say the other way around there. I think I've dropped a bit of a goalie myself. Turning a negative statement, taking a negative statement, make it positive. So Zoe mentioned about behaviour. You might have, for example, a mentee that says to the students, don't be rude. Well, actually, taking that is quite a negative statement. So what about something like, in this school, we speak to each other with kindness and respect? So you're actually taking the negative statement that your mentee might use and making it positive. Recording the improvements for motivation in their log, because they will undoubtedly have to keep evidence for this, and following that up so that the mentee has got concrete plans for implementing that target. And fix the date for review, and always say to your mentee, right, just remind me, when are you going to do this by? Let's just run through this again. What have we agreed? So you're actually giving them an opportunity to tell you yourself in their own words what you've discussed with them. Okay, we're now going to move on to the observing and giving feedback. So it's really important to, and I think we've missed a slide out here somewhere. I think somehow we've missed one. I've put something in here which don't know why we've missed it, but anyway, we'll talk about it. It's really vital when you are observing and giving feedback that you must make sure you do it with a view to inspiring your mentee and not demoralize them. You must give high quality feedback, because you're going to conduct that lesson, and it's probably the greatest opportunity that you've got to directly influence their practice and their impact in the classroom. But always remember that if things go wrong or things don't go according to plan, that particular observation that you've seen is just a moment in time. It's just something which is part of the entire jigsaw that you're going to give when you have to grade or give comment at the end of the time that you've got with your mentee. But it's so important to be in the moment. So when you're observing your mentee, don't be sitting there. Well, I'm not telling you to not do this, but this is bad practice in my opinion. Not be sitting there on your laptop. You need to be in the moment. I've been in lessons where mentees have been observed by somebody who's been maybe on their phone checking their emails, and I've been sitting there thinking, you're not actually giving that mentee the benefit of your time. You're doing this job, so you need to be there and thinking, I'm going to be there, I'm not going to have any distractions, low stakes environment, free from distraction, and I'm going to give that mentee the maximum amount of time, which is my time, to look at what they're doing. Talk to the students in the classroom, get their perception of what's going on. What are they actually doing? Ask them what they're learning. And when I observe lessons, it's very rare I write anything down for the first 25 minutes if I'm doing a full hour or however long the time is. And I tend to sort of get the feel for the classroom and see what actually is going on and just get that feeling. And then I might make a few notes, and then I go away and I write it up. It's a bit different if you're teaching all day. You might need to make notes. I get that. The other thing that you also might do is, if you're popping into your colleague's lesson, your mentee's lesson, you know, you're not necessarily going to go in there with a clipboard and write things down. I always wear a jacket when I'm in school and I'm doing stuff. Even in the summer, I might have a pocket, and I carry a little notebook, which is really tiny. In fact, it's this size, it's really small. And when I come out, I just write a few notes in it so that I feel that I've got some feedback I can give to the person I'm observing. So when you are giving your feedback, that low stakes environment, obviously you're not going to do this in the corridor. You've got to make sure you give that feedback in an environment that is non-threatening, that is somewhere really comfortable, and is really where you're not going to be disturbed. And that's really difficult. I know it's difficult because I've done this many times, finding somewhere to give the feedback. So that's something that you have to give yourself time to think about how you're going to do that. It's praising your strengths and your progress. We've talked about being really positive with your mentee. Be wary of giving an opinion, because your opinion is different to somebody else's opinion. Keep that visible, backing it up with evidence. You know, if you see a member of staff who you've just taught and you looked at the end of the lesson, you say the pupils packed up really well as you did it in sequence steps, so that you did everything you asked. They did everything you asked. Always have some evidence to be able to show or to talk about and be tangible that you've seen in that lesson before giving an opinion. Those of you that are familiar with Austin's butterfly, always be kind, be helpful and specific with your feedback. Any missed opportunities, any bite-sized bits of information you can give your mentee that will enable them to improve their performance and their impact in the classroom. So you're giving them those missed opportunities for the marginal gains that they get, the tiny spokes of a bicycle wheel. How could they improve their practice? And the language that you use when you're giving feedback is crucial. Always be careful when you're thinking about it. Be really careful how you're going to go about this. You know, I always say thank you for letting me come into your lesson and observing it. And you know, one of the real strengths I saw in your lesson and then was this, and this was evidenced by when you did this. And that way you're linking directly to the performance of the teacher in terms of how well they've done in the lesson and what you've seen to do that, to back that up. Looking at what the mentee says in the lesson and does and impacts, how that impacts on the students. I always write down some things that the mentee has said in the lesson, so I can refer back to that and look at how that's gone in the lesson. And again, Zoe mentioned, didn't she, about how to share what you do with your classes. Be wary of saying I would have done this, because you don't want to undermine the person who you're observing. Some of the things I've said to mentees has been, you know, how was today's lesson, what you did today, how will that influence what you do next? Or how did you know that the students had learned from that particular activity? So again, it's all about the types of things you might say. And again, if you're interested, I've got a list of hundreds of questions, well, not questions, but comments and types of questions that you could use in that sort of situation. There is one type of coaching that is very focused on the how, and it's called instructional coaching. You may well have come across that, but it actually gives you sort of a direction of, you know, what did you notice? How did that affect the pupils? What's worked well? What surprised you and what have you learned? And what will you do differently next time? It gives you that opportunity to probe the areas for development and to set precise actions and make a plan based on these actions and then practice it. But we've talked about this in the previous couple of slides. And the final thing I want to talk about in tonight's session is having the difficult conversations, because we all have to have these at some stage. I've had more than I like to have had, having done the various roles that I've done. You know, I've had to work with staff in all guises of capabilities and with difficult situations. So I have got a lot of experience in this. But it's really about changing that mindset, about not labeling that as a difficult conversation, because if you handle it so that it produces a kind of better outcome it's less pain for you and less pain for your mentee. I think it's, as the third bullet point I've put, is having a constructive conversation about development. It's just normal. That's what you're doing. It's a normal conversation. And finding the right words, framing it in a positive way, keeping it simple, keeping it clear, keeping it direct and neutral. You know, what is there to learn here is what you really need to be thinking about. Challenging positively as well, referring to the achievements and the possible qualities and the potential that the colleague that you're observing, the mentee, has, because it will be a nerve-wracking situation that you're in, and it's not an easy thing to have to do, but sometimes, you know, needs must. Being able to breathe before the session, you know, the calmer you are, the better it will be. I often sometimes go and get myself a breath of fresh air before I have to do something like this. That's not always possible, I get that, but sometimes you just need to have that, just get that intake of fresh air, or whatever it is that you need to do to be able to get you in the best possible frame of mind, to be able to go in there and be as positive about this as you can with the person that you're having to speak to. I don't usually plan. I plan, but I don't script the conversation. You know, I jot down keynotes and possibly key points that I might use, but I also do have a strategy. I do have a toolkit, a flexible possible kind of repertoire of possible questions or answers that I might have to deal with. And again, sometimes you might have to rehearse that beforehand, because you don't know what state of mind the colleague is that you're having to give. It's really crucial, if there's anything new coming out of this, if it is to do with the teaching, because sometimes difficult conversations are to do with other matters. I've had all sorts of different scenarios that I've dealt with. I mean, I can think of one in the last 5 years where we had a colleague who was a mentee, a young teacher who was putting things out on Facebook and all the social media about things about the school, didn't really have any clue as to how that was being perceived by the school, and therefore we had to go and bring sort of outside agencies in to sort of kind of like sort this out, because even though that colleague had been told several times by the school that this wasn't appropriate, it's just, well, the message just wasn't getting through. So, you know, sometimes you are dealing with things that are not to do with the teaching. There was a very strong practitioner who had some very great relationships with parents, colleagues and students, and it was just that aspect of the professionalism which unfortunately didn't get resolved in the right way and resulted in a very unfavourable outcome. But it's about being able to model the new learning, because if you know, action that you're going to ask that member of staff to do is kind of born out of poor understanding, then it's going to be flawed. So you need to be able to model what it is, and they must understand it, and check they understand it on a number of occasions. You know, it's not about doing a written test and saying, right, we're going to test that you know this. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, do they actually understand what you're asking them to do? And it may well be that you have to model it with them in your classroom and they see what's going on. But also it's important to acknowledge their perspective and see what their solutions are, without saying, well, it's my way or the highway, as some people do. And I know sometimes it's difficult when you are working in a school which has particular policies, and you might be working in a particular range of schools or trust or an authority where things have to be done in a certain way. And I understand that you are bound by the policies and the things that you have to do in your own institution. So that is a fine balancing act to have to deal with. If you show compassion and that you care, and that it's important to you and to the mentee that the relationship needs to be kept intact, because the last thing I think most people who become, well, most of us, if not all of us, who become a mentor, who want to keep this job, you know, to see it from the beginning to the end, if that's possible. Obviously, there are things, if you know, if colleagues are ill, or if something happens and you move schools, or you get another job, or you get promotion, that's not always possible. But in the main, it's really great to keep that intact, and being able to ask that mentee how they feel, you know, and let them sort of sound off steam at times is important, and it's all part of the difficult conversation. But certainly don't feel that you have to respond straight away all the time in this conversation. Slowing down and listening and taking a pause a little bit before you respond can often diffuse sort of the emotions that can happen, and also on the part of the other person as well, because these conversations can be very stressful in some situations that you find yourselves. But giving something back at the end of it, whereas whilst at the same time supporting the mentee to own the solution, it is also crucial, because they feel then that they're coming away from this situation not having been totally flattened, but feel that they are part of the way forward from the difficult conversation. And asking them, you know, what's the most important thing to work on? Now you see the situation differently if that's the outcome of the conversation. So in the mentoring in the future, what's happening as we go forward is that from this year, it's going to be a statutory requirement for all schools to offer all early career teachers a 2-year induction based on the ECF, which is the Early Careers Framework in the UK. And you can see there on the right hand side, I've put a link to that. And even if you're not part of this country or this situation, I would urge you to take a look at that website, because there are some very good resources on there which may well be useful for you as a mentor and even for your mentees going forward. And those are the 3 types of induction based schemes that are running. Okay. Forward planning for yourself as a mentor. But always remember, and on here, this looks really busy, but it's not. I've put on here some screen grabs from Twitter, because there are some NQT and ITT mentor groups out there. There are also some Facebook groups, and there are some NQT groups as well if you are primary teaching, or for your trainee teachers, which I know I put these on the NQT new teacher trainee session we did a few weeks ago. And also if you're a linguist, there are the ALL language meetings that take place in the first Friday of every month. And obviously they're online at the moment. The first one was, well, the last one was the 5th of February. There will be one coming up this Friday from 8 till 9. But I think you need to be aware of, you need to remind yourselves that this will be the most challenging period in your career as a mentor. You need to remind yourselves every day that what's going well for you and your mentee, because there always is something going well. And anything that doesn't go well for you as a mentor is just a moment in time. It's not something to beat yourself up about if you drop the ball. We're all human, and that's not something to be worried or ashamed about. You're not on your own. There's always loads of people out there who are willing to talk to you. And don't try to control what you can't control, because there's lots of things out of our control at the moment. And as we move back towards schools in England, and obviously wherever you are in the world, you may well already be teaching either in school fully or maybe partly remotely, all sorts of things happening. So there are sorts of things going on out there that we can't control. And it's okay to ask for help. I'd be really grateful if tonight's session you found useful. You could give us a shout out on Twitter or on Facebook, on your own sites or any other sites, to say that you've found it useful, and to give us some sort of, you know, recognition that you hopefully found it useful. And as always with my sessions and with Zoe's sessions, if there is anything that you want us to follow up on in any way, shape or form, if there's any resources at all you would like us to do, because I've spent a lot of my last 10 years working with, you know, recently qualified teachers and newly qualified teachers. In fact, set up a handbook for them and ran a big appropriate body from 2013 to 2016 actually, for 3 years. I had to set that up 11 local authorities working with my last trust, so I myself know the situation inside out. We also have some upcoming webinars, which you can see here on our slide. This one was today, obviously this, and then next week we have a session on getting the most out of Languagenut, focusing on the language on the admin area, and you can see there all our forthcoming webinars. Okay, and as always, our email addresses are on the last page. Elaine at Languagenut, Zoe, who is my other colleague who you've met this evening and who I'm sure will be popping up in a second, and Dan, who looks after all our teacher trainers, our demos and things, and he does an awful lot of work with our teachers as part of the lead on that, for which we have a team that work with him as well. So Zoe, I can't see anything in the chat, but I'm going to have a look now because I'm going to make this screen a little bit smaller, and I'll hand back to you if there's anything that you would like, or if anything that's come in the chat that I might be able to help with.
That's great. Yeah, so keep the screen big if that's right, please. Oh,
sorry,
okay.
sorry.
No, it's fine. Yeah, so we've had we've had a couple of questions. Or one, just a quick one is, will we get this emailed to us? Yes, so we will. We will put the recording out on our website.
Yeah.
And we will we can send resources. That's not a problem. Please do add any other questions. We've got a couple of minutes left, but one other question for Elaine is something which I think a lot of people have experienced this with the changing demographics of the teaching profession at the moment. Is a teacher called Emma has said that she is suffering from imposter syndrome at the moment. She is in her 3rd year of teaching herself, but is now a mentor. Yeah. And feels like she's only really barely more experience than the person she's meant to be mentoring. Yeah. So do you have any advice for anyone in that kind of situation?
Notice I've paused before I've answered. Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with going back again and saying, well, you know, I'm just a little making sure that your mentee knows that you are actually on this journey together, that you're learning together. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think your mentee will be grateful of the fact that you've acknowledged that with them. Obviously, it's a difficult one in terms of how confident you feel with the situation that you're in. Are there any other mentors in your school who you can talk to if you feel that you have any issues? Or, as I said to you before, the stuff that's on the ECF, the email, the last second to last slide, I think it was, you could have a look on there. There's some really good kind of like things you can put yourself through, some little training things to work on any areas that you feel that you are vulnerable around.
Great, thanks very much. I think that's really useful. From just if I can chip in as well, I think that sometimes there can be an advantage actually to having a more of a more recent insight into what it's like to be new yourself. So I think there's absolutely advantage to both, to being extremely experienced and to being less experienced. And I think, as Elaine said, if you're open about that, and you can use it to your advantage where possible. I think, frankly, imposter syndrome is very common amongst teachers. I'm sure you'll agree, Elaine, that sometimes you can feel after however long you've been teaching, like, oh, do I really know what I'm doing?
Yeah, I learn something new every day. And people say to me, oh, you've got a lot of it. I would never allow anybody to say, oh, you're an expert in this, because you're not. I'm not, definitely. I've got a lot of experience that I can share, but I'm certainly not an expert, because I learn something new every day, and it's great to do that.
Yeah, I think there's actually a parallel with the question of with language teachers, whether you are a native speaker or a non-native speaker. There are advantages of both. So if you're a native speaker, obviously, of course, your subject knowledge will be second to none, and there are absolute advantages to that. But there's an advantage to being a non-native speaker teaching French, German, Spanish, or whatever, as in that you have been in the same position that your students have been in, and you know what it is like to try to remember, how adjectival agreements work in German, for example, which is always my bugbear. So I would also say use that to your advantage where possible.
Definitely.
I think we're about to finish now, so any final questions, please do contact us.
Yeah.
And please do put your feedback in the chat or to email us. We would love to hear what you thought of the session, and please, as Elaine said, let us know on let people know on social media that you've attended, and whether you thought it was any good. Check out our upcoming webinars. We've got plenty more coming up as well. So thank you very much for attending.
Yeah, thank you, and have a nice evening.